on DAFs today. And just to put this in context, I mean, there's a lot of important things happening in philanthropy. We get to talk about a lot of them. But personally, I think, and the sort of broader FreeWill team thinks, and I think we've convinced a lot of folks in the space that this is true, that there are three massive trends happening to fundraising and philanthropy right now that are going to radically shape the next 5 to 10 years. And if you want to be good at your job in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 1 year, you have to get really good at these three things. So what are they? In no particular order, they are one, the great wealth transfer and the massive shift in planned giving. Some of you have an updated Mac and you can tell that cameras will create these things. Two, right? So great wealth transfer. Two is the rise of donor advised funds. That's what we're going to talk about today. And three is the radical and rapid expansion of artificial intelligence and how that's going to shape the future of work and the shape of what we do, right? So we actually talk, as we map out the webinar calendar over the next year, we really put some extra focus on those things because those are the most important things for you all to get smart about over this timeline, right? So I hope that makes sense. By the way, I think some of you might be at Icon in Toronto. So if a bunch of you are in Toronto together, hope you're having a great time there. All right, a couple quick housekeeping notes. One, this event is approved for CFRE credits. At the end of the webinar, we're going to drop a survey in the chat. Use that to certify your participation, right? So at the end of the session, please do that. And if you get audited, we use these surveys to back you up, right? So that's how this works. By the way, if you're watching the recording in the future, you can watch the recording and get CFRE credits as well. And if you do that, just please make a note for yourself the date and time that you watched it. Here's a quick agenda. I won't read it all out, but what I will tell you is that we will send around the recording and the slides afterwards. Some of you will still ask that in 10 minutes. That's okay. But if you want to take notes and you learn better that way, great. If not, feel free to sit back with your coffee or your tea. And also, one big ask is that if you find this useful, please consider forwarding it to someone else on your team who also needs to get smarter about the same things. All right, quick intros. My name is Patrick. I'm lucky to be the co-founder and co-CEO of FreeWill alongside Jenny, pictured here. Jenny's awesome. I'm currently in Palo Alto, California, the birthplace of FreeWill, as it happens. And Jenny is in Seattle. Although currently actually at a women's leadership event in Nashville. So we've swapped places for the moment. We are lucky to work alongside a team of nearly 200 folks, raising almost $10 billion to date, more than 1,500 nonprofit partners, including many of you. If that is you, a big thank you. If it's not, no problem, we still love you, but we'd encourage you to at least check out freewill.com and some of the work that we do for nonprofits. And together, the team has more than 4 centuries of fundraising experience, and a lot of that goes into research like this, right? So I get to present. My colleague Phoebe's on the line. She put a ton of work in here, a bunch of other folks as well. And so big shout out to those people. Last thing on housekeeping, we are so grateful you're here. We're so grateful you're pushing yourself to enhance your career and enhance the likelihood that your organization is going to hit and exceed its goals. And so one thank you is that we're going to send one of my favorite books, which happens every week, to 20 people as a gift. Katie Thomas says this is a great book. Thank you, Katie. I really, really enjoyed it. By a gentleman named Srinivasan, I think. And what Boo did is Boo's a immigrant from, I believe, Sri Lanka, although I could be wrong, and sort of looks at American history from the history of money and the history of how money works. And so it's a really interesting sense of how did the American economy get to be the way it is? And for those of you that have to think about money in the economy all day because you are fundraisers, it's an important thing. So at the end, again, survey at the end of the webinar, make a note there, and we will send it to you. All right, a couple quick things. One is we asked how your week is going, a little dip. I don't know if folks didn't enjoy the eclipse as much as we expected, or if just the news is getting you down. But also in terms of progress towards goals, also a slight decrease from 2 weeks ago. Not a big shift. Some of this can just be statistical noise, but worth noting, right? So if we do this to give you a sense of how other people are feeling. Okay, so now we're going to dive into donor advised funds, which is one of these big 3 trends that is happening. We're going to talk about some basics. Many of you will know this cold. Many of you don't, right? So we're going to very quickly go through this concept of how donor advised funds work, why they're growing, and then we'll talk a lot more about actions that you can take. What is a donor advised fund? A donor advised fund is when donors put money into an investment fund with a sponsoring organization. That sponsoring organization itself is technically a charity. This is an important point. And then they recommend grants out to a sort of a more programmatic charity, like where most of you will work, at a later point. The big shift here is the donor gets an immediate tax benefit, even if the money doesn't go to charities like yours for years. While donors technically recommend grants, and the money is no longer theirs, it's really in the hands of the sponsoring organization. Sponsoring organizations very rarely go against the donor's wishes unless it's distinctly off policy or illegal. Now, why is that? Why would they go off? Why would they not go off wishes? Well, if they started going off donor wishes, then nobody would ever put their money in that sponsoring organization again. And so even though they're not forced to, the actual mechanics and incentives of how this all works means they are sort of forced to, and the donor really retains a lot of that power. Money is usually invested in this account, and it's usually invested in things like mutual funds or index funds. Now, mutual funds, if you don't know what these are, tend to be a collection of stocks or other assets. Index funds are things like the S&P 500, where you can invest in the whole thing. So the fund tends to grow over time. Not always, right? Stocks are up and down, and this is not financial advice. But on average, over the years, stocks tend to grow. Sponsoring organizations generally make money on what we call management fees, and possibly twice. So what does that mean? That means if you work at Fidelity Charitable and you run a big donor advised fund, somehow the folks that work at Fidelity need to get paid, otherwise they wouldn't work there. So there tends to be a small management fee on the overall fund every year, and that comes out of the fund. Now, also, if you are Fidelity Charitable and you might be allied, right? Fidelity Charitable is a 501c3, I think, but it's a charitable organization. You are allied with Fidelity, the main financial company. Well, you are often investing things in the donor advised funds in Fidelity run mutual funds. And when you invest in a mutual fund, whoever's running the mutual fund tends to get a small fee as well, right? So that's how these folks make money. And by the way, making money and having these fees is not, itself a bad thing, because otherwise they wouldn't exist and you need folks to run the system. What can donors give to a donor advised fund? Well, donors can contribute cash, and a lot of people think about that. But actually, the biggest things that people are giving are publicly traded securities, stocks, crypto, mutual funds, non-publicly traded assets. Like if you have stock in a startup or a private company, you can donate that. Many DAF sponsors require minimum contributions between $5,000 and $25,000. At community foundations, these can be as high as $500,000, right? So there's some minimum to open an account at a lot of places. Some community foundations can be as high as $500,000, but Fidelity and Schwab, which are two of the largest donor advised funds, have pushed those minimums down to zero. They want as many people opening donor advised fund accounts, and they assume that many of them will grow over time. We are now in a place where it is easy for anyone to open a donor advised fund account, which was not true 10 years ago, and is one of many reasons that these things are exploding. So how did DAFs differ from other non-cash gifts, right? Just a couple of quick things to keep you and your donors out of trouble, mostly your donors, but we want to help them. If you're hosting events or giving away things of value with donations, DAFs cannot pay for these because it is a charitable tax-deductible gift account that has already been tax benefit given. You also can't do bifurcated payments, but things like stock giving or crypto could be used for the whole ticket, and most people don't know this. Donors can save on capital gains for the whole gift and get a big but not full tax deduction. A couple of different types of donor advised funds that we should be familiar with. One is community foundations, right? These are the oldest. These have tended to exist for the longest. They're independent organizations created by and for people in a local area. And then there's national DAFs. These are the things that have been exploding, right? These are charitable arms of financial institutions like Fidelity or Schwab or Goldman Sachs or Bank of America. And then single issue donor advised funds. These are much rarer, and we're not going to talk much about them today. but institutions that create DAF programs to mobilize members around a certain identity or faith, or most commonly an organization. So some universities and some hospitals have donor advised funds, but these tend to be the biggest universities, right? So again, not applicable to most folks. Let's talk about the state of DAFs, right? What is happening here? There are nearly 2 million donor advised fund accounts in the United States. In 2022, grants from donor advised funds amounted to 22.5% of the total assets that were held there in 2021, and $52 billion was granted to charities in 2022, which was a new high until likely 2023. It's a 9% increase from the previous year, and grant making has been on the rise virtually every year since 2009. $52 billion is a ton of money. And to give you an idea, about $350 billion was given in individual contributions that year, which means that 1 in every $7 that you're getting in terms of donations is from a donor advised fund. And this is a huge deal. Now, FreeWill and our friends over at the Wren Charitable Foundation have done some early work to give you an early look on what happened in 2023. Now, we will be clear that the best reporting in this space historically has been from NPT, the Nonprofit Philanthropic Trust. And they do a lot of great work, and that data comes out typically in November. So it's a long time into 2024 to figure out what happened in 2023. And so we've done some work to get an early sense of what sort of trends are happening to better inform your strategies right now. And then we'll all get a much bigger picture when the NPT report comes out. And we want to thank NPT for all of their great work. So we teamed up with our friends at Wren Charitable Foundation. And what Wren does is Wren runs the software for donor advised funds at a ton of different financial institutions. So using this work and using this partnership, we can get an early look at broad trends in the space. So a couple quick things, right? And what we looked at the most is what happened in 2022 and how did that change in 2023? This is really, really exciting. So big takeaway, accounts, contributions, and grant transactions have all expanded significantly. What's an account? It's how many people have a DAF. What's a contribution? It's how much money goes into the DAF. And what's a grant is how much money comes out of the DAF, right? So those are the three things that we're going to look at. It's especially true over the last 5 years. We are on a hockey stick curve in donor advised funds. And if you're not smart about donor advised funds yet, this is exactly the time to do it. Really, the time to do it was 3 years ago. Next best time is now. So 2023 marked the year with the second highest number of new DAF account creations, only after 2021, which, like 2023, was a banner year for stocks in the stock market. There was 20% growth in the DAF accounts created from 2022 to 2023. This is a huge number for a relatively strong base. And over the past 5 years, a surge in active DAF accounts has increased by 200%, or another way to say is it tripled, right? Huge growth, while the rest of philanthropy is holding steady. This is a really, really big deal. In 2023, there was also a huge increase in DAF contributions. DAF contributions through Wren grew by 170% in terms of dollars. That is a giant amount of money. And what it means, some of that money has been given out. A lot of that money is going to be given out in 2024, right? So if you're not really dialed into this yet, it is time to get dialed in. They grew 15% in volume. So this is really interesting. 15% more gifts, 170% more money, right? Huge push here. And we'll talk more about why that happened in the first place. The contribution to DAFs, and the average contribution was larger the previous years. You might guess this by the fact that money went up faster than number of contributions. And these tend to come in to DAFs at the end of the year in both years. End of year contributions into DAFs is really common. Why is that? It's because your financial advisor looks at you and says, this stock went up, this went down. Let's give this stuff to the DAF and we'll save on taxes that year. From the end of 2022 to 2023, there was a 41% increase in the total assets in DAFs. This is astonishing growth. We'll talk more about that and why that happened. And at the end of 2023, each DAF held assets that were 27% larger than the end of 2022, right? So how is that 41% number? Each account is larger and there are more accounts, right? That's how this works. This is a huge deal, right? Again, we talked about $52 billion coming out in 2022. And wow, there was a huge increase in number of accounts, average account, and more in 2023. So we are poised for enormous growth in 23 and 24. We saw also, very good news, giving out of DAFs was up. Money flowing out of DAFs started to increase in August. And the average DAF grant increased from 7,000 to 9,000 in 2023. So each individual grant to charities is better and bigger, And so why is all this happening? Well, one thing is, hey, donors are hearing more about donor advised funds. Financial advisors are talking more about donor advised funds. Do not underestimate the role of financial advisors in growing donor advised funds. That is a really big deal. But the other thing that really, really matters for charitable giving and matters even more for donor advised funds is we need to understand how DAFs are affected by stock market gains. And this gives us a really good chance to see into the future. If we know how the stock market did in the last 12 months, then we can project how DAF giving and DAF grants will happen in the next 12 months. 2019. So in 2019, S&P went up by 29%. Awesome year for stocks. DAF's up by 20%. Also quite good. DAFs actually grew more slowly than stocks, which was interesting, but DAFs grew up considerably. Now by 2020, DAF's up, S&P up another 16%, another good year for stocks, but DAF's up by a quarter. Wow, I mean, really strong growth here. DAF's 10% faster. 2021, S&P up 27%, DAF's up 35%, which means 8% faster. Now, those of you that are doing that know compound growth know that 19 plus 26 plus 35 tends to be about a doubling. It doesn't have to equal 100% as we're doing this compound year over year. So that's a big deal. 2022, this was a really good test case. S&P went down by almost 20%. Really rough year for stocks. Rough year for your 401ks. And yet, DAF still chugged along and grew by almost 10%. Now, that was a really striking sign. In fact, the gap between DAF growth and stock growth is getting faster and faster every year. And in 2023, S&P's up about another 24%. In total giving, TBD on DAFs, right? But you might expect that we see another 20 or 30% growth in DAF giving this past year based on those stock market numbers. So it's really important that we understand this because it allows us to deduce into what the future might bring because we have all the facts already. So a couple other key takeaways from a bunch of research that we did, and I want to share this before we get into, okay, but how do I actually just get more DAF gifts? One is when we ask you all, right? We surveyed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of charities, and 3/4 said DAFs are more important this year than last. More than 2 out of every 5 fundraisers said securing more DAFs gifts is a high or very high priority for the organization in 2024. And they're also tied with stock gifts for the most commonly received non-cash gift in 2023, right? So DAFs are exploding. Stock gifts also getting a lot bigger, which is very good news. They're also warming up to DAFs, right? So about 4 years ago, you saw all these articles about charities saying, oh, this money is zombie philanthropy, et cetera. And what we see is behavior starting to change here. Nearly 2/3 of fundraisers see DAFs as a positive for philanthropy. 61% of fundraisers said that DAFs result in more funds in the hands of working charities as opposed to less. And over half of surveyed organizations are actively soliciting or promoting DAFs as a way to give in 2024. This number is actually sort of disappointing to me. It should be 90% of charities are actively soliciting DAF gifts as a way to give in 2024, because if your organization is not doing this, you are then missing out on some very large gifts. It's incredibly important that you're doing this. Insight number 3 from our research, identifying DAF donors remains a challenge. It's an ongoing problem for orgs, and more nonprofits reported struggling with this than in 2023. Over 3 million Americans own a donor advised fund, yet 60% of fundraisers say that one of their biggest challenges is not knowing which of their donors have a donor advised fund. Other challenges include not knowing how to ask or too many anonymous donations, which are the other most commonly suggested problems. Insight 4, national DApps, the Fidelities, the Schwabs, the Vanguards, the Goldman Sachses of the world, might be more popular than we thought. 82% of surveyed fundraisers hold a favorable or very favorable view of national DApps, and favorability of national DApps increased across all organization sizes. Respondents answered similarly regarding community foundations, and 81% of fundraisers hold a very favorable or favorable view of community foundations. Biggest takeaway here is that we need to prioritize donor advised fund giving. There is no serious path to fundraising success in 2024 that does not have a plan for donor advised funds. Why is that? Because you are going to be looking at $250 billion sitting in donor advised funds, likely $60 or $70 billion granted out of donor advised funds to organizations like yours, and yet not enough folks are asking for it. In 2022, the S&P had its worst year since 2008, but DApps still grew by 10%. And again, up by 24% in 2023. 2024 is showing record highs. And so we should be expecting a massive, massive, massive 2024 for DApp giving. And if you don't have a plan, we want you to get a plan right now, and we'll talk more about what that plan could be. Okay, so if you're still with me and you hope this is useful so far, just let me know in the chat. But we're going to dive in now on what do you actually need to do in 2024 to get these gifts. Step 1, understand your DAF donors. DAFs are relatively new to you, right? A lot of you are all here because we want to be learning more about it. And you are, for the most part, a professional who works only in the field of nonprofit fundraising, and it's your job to get smart about this stuff. What it means is that for hundreds of thousands of new accounts opened in the last few years, they are also totally new to donors, and our donors are still trying to understand how to use them, right? So it's not like these folks are super smart and you're wandering around in the darkness. You are smarter about DApps than they are, and they're trying to figure out this new tool. If we shape behavior now, that will continue for decades to come, right? So the work that we're doing now is so important to hit our goals in 2024. It is also the case that there's no signs of slowing down here. And so hitting our goals in 2025 and 2035 depend on shaping behavior right now. Donors opening DAFs are starting to shift younger. We know that 80% of donors are DAF donors are over 50, but 13% of DAFs were opened by millennials in 2019, and that number is going way up. And the shift is in part because workplaces are adding donor advised funds as a perk, and more sponsoring organizations are offering low or zero minimum contributions. DAP donors are extremely engaged in giving. 88% of Fidelity charitable DAFs made at least one grant in 2022. The average account makes 12 grants, and donors are committed to their favorite charities and causes, right? So these are very active donors. The idea that it's money just hanging out there is actually false. More than 3/4 of grants from Fidelity charitable DAFs went to a charity that the donor had previously supported. What does that mean? It means the DAF donors you are looking for are already in your donor base, right? This is an incredibly important part. There's no sort of secret council of DAF donors that if we could only get in front of them, then we would get all these DAF gifts. The DAF donors who are going to give to you are people you're already in contact with, but you don't know that they have a donor advised fund. They're also incredibly tech savvy. Almost all national DAF donors go online to recommend grants. 94% of Fidelity Charitable recommends grants online. That is a big deal. Another key tip here, right? Let's think about who has one. Your board members and your former board members have them. Previous board members fit the demographic, psychographic, and behavioral trends of DAF donors. And so we want to make a list of all of our past board members and make a call, right? Go check on them and make sure to ask whether they have a donor advised fund. This is a thing that some folks miss. 3, we want to have a tag in our donor base, in our database, that says has a donor advised fund. Everyone you find out from surveys or one-on-one conversations, even if you haven't gotten a DAF gift yet, you want to know this is a person with a donor advised fund so we can message them in the future in this particular way. Some of your CRMs don't have this. That is a real problem, right? I have no interest in, no sort of commercial interest in any CRMs. And yet, if your CRM doesn't have one, go write a letter today and say, what the heck? Fix this. This is really important. And so you're going to have to repurpose a different tag and do that, right? Step 4, how do we navigate national DAFs? So a lot of people talk to me or talk to folks on our team and say, Patrick, how do I get in front of Fidelity donors? National DAFs, it's important to understand, have a less active role in recommending nonprofits, and they are not seen by their donors as experts in where to give. Remember, outreach to national DAFs may be a poor use of time. Your focus should instead be cultivating your supporters and your donors who already have these accounts, but we do want to understand the massive growth of accounts at these entities, right? Step 5, many donors don't know that recurring donations are an option from DAFs. This is an important point here. And what that means is that you can set up a donor advised fund to give a monthly or quarterly or annual gift to your organization. But we need to give donors a reason for them to do this. And here's some of the language that will be most useful. One of the biggest barriers to even more impact is that we often don't have certainty about how much money will come in during a given year. Many people choose to make a recurring gift because it allows us to plan more thoughtfully and make the most of your donations. And you can always cancel it if you change your mind. Step 6, asking about beneficiary designations. Many donors don't have beneficiary designations for their donor advised funds. Someone in the chat asked, what happens if a donor passes away when in that DAF money? What happens to it? Well, what you really want to do is make sure that that designation could be your organization. Here's a quick bit of language you can use. One thing I've seen is that many of our donors forget to add beneficiary designations. You may have already thought about this, right? We're giving intellectual credit to the donor, but just in case I want to raise it, would you like me to talk you through some of the options? Now, what are the options, by the way? Well, one thing is that if you have a donor advised fund account, you can leave it to your daughter. You can say your daughter is in charge of future grant making if I pass it. You can say it all goes to the American Red Cross. I love the American Red Cross. I'm going to make grants for my lifetime, but when I pass away, it's all going to go to the Red Cross. Great. And then if that doesn't happen, what happens? Well, it doesn't sort of get sucked into the Fidelity machine, right? What does happen is Fidelity says, okay, knowing what we know, given that the sponsor organization actually owns the assets, we're going to go give more to the causes that this person cared about. And if not, we'll sort of give it generally. But they're not allowed to sort of take it back and keep it as profit. Some people ask about that. And that's not how it works. All right, number 7, remember about matching gifts, right? Another thing that many donors don't know, remember, because it's all so new to them, is that their employer may match grants from donor advised funds, but the employers very rarely match grants to donor advised funds. So one piece of language you can use is, thank you so much for your grant. You may already know this, but many of our supporters don't realize that they can get their donor advised fund gift matched by an employer. Does your employer do matching gifts? A couple other things that we're seeing, right? A lot of folks are using cool technology. I'll show you a little bit of this. And what it does is it captures donor. This is on your existing website where folks are capturing existing data, right? Say, great, let us know where this grant is going, how much you're granting, and then you can actually log in to your donor advised fund account from the checkout page, right? From your own website. And this is super cool because then you make a $45,000 grant right from that checkout page, and you're totally done, right? So in about 90 seconds, without leaving your website, you can make a donor advised fund grant. Why is this so good? One of the things that I think we're missing here in donor advised funds is that we're not asking enough, right? All this money is hanging out, and then sometimes nonprofits, will say, why isn't more money coming out? And yet only half of us are actively marketing donor advised fund grants. So what we find is that people do the thing you ask them to do, but not if we don't ask them. And so what we want to do is, yes, we want to occasionally send messages about donor advised funds explicitly. But what we can also do is just bake it into our normal work. When you are sending a normal fundraising email, right, you cannot just ask for $50 or $100 cash gifts because those are going to be so much smaller, right? We've already established that the average staff grant this year is $9,000. And so what we're going to see here is that the successful organizations in every direct mail, in every email is saying, do you want to chip in to help the animal shelter? Oh, and by the way, you can give stock, you can give out of your donor advised funds, you can make a qualified charitable distribution. And really pushing this non-cash option is going to drive much larger gifts and help you identify all of these donor advised fund accounts. Now, just to be clear, why is it so much better to know that we're getting a $500 cash gift versus an identical donor advised fund gift? Well, when we get that DAF gift, we've now identified someone who has a DAF, which means they have money set aside for charitable intent. And we can go back and ask them, right? We can ask them the next time. And so this can be really, really useful. So the best way to, I'm seeing a note from Alicia that says, yes, Patrick, I'm trying to get my website team on board with not just pushing cash gifts. Alicia, you can send them this session. So what is the best way to get exceptional at DAFs, right? We really want to get more DAF grants. But the thing to understand about why DAFs have grown so quickly, and we don't talk about this. People say, oh, DAFs are exploding. And we never ask why. And the why, the biggest reason that donor advised funds are exploding is because donor advised funds have gotten really good, really, really good, much better than you all. You could be this good, but we're not there yet. Really good at asking for non-cash assets. So 2/3 of everything they raise is not cash. It's stock, it's mutual funds, it's crypto, it's privately held assets. Only 1/3 is cash. Now, if you look at your own organization, it's probably not 2/3, 1/3. It might be 80-20 cash to non-cash assets, but if you had the 1/3 ratio, you would also be growing faster. And national DAFs make it particularly easy, which is why they are growing so much faster than the other types of community foundations, which don't do as good a job making it easy, right? The key lesson here is the easier it is to give non-cash gifts to your organization, the faster you grow, whether you are a donor advised fund or whether you are a normal charity. If you can make it easy and accessible for donors to give you stock or mutual funds or crypto, a lot of this will come right to you and skip the DAF. Now, we still want to make it really easy to give from the DAF, but we also want to make sure we're easily pulling this in. And one of the things that we thought when we looked up 2 years ago and said, well, I bet stock giving is going to go way down to charities. Why? Because it's going to go into donor advised funds, and then people will stop giving stock to charities. They'll just give it to donor advised funds and later give grants. And that's what it seems like a perfectly reasonable and logical conclusion. But we were wrong. And 2023 was one of the strongest years for stock gifts on record. Now, how did that happen? What turns out is that donors got used to giving stock to donor advised funds and then said, oh, this is great from a tax perspective, and it's easy. And as long as I'm being asked to do it, I'll do it. And so suddenly DAF gifts are way up, as we talked about, but stock gifts directly to charity are also way up. Now, some of this is all of the accrued gains in the stock market. So I don't want to underplay that role, but making non-cash gifts easy is what's driving Fidelity's growth and what is driving the growth of many traditional nonprofits. And so this is a really, really, really important point. So in normal fundraising emails, we think about the normal stuff, your normal fundraising emails, your normal direct mail, and your normal conversations with major gift prospects, we want to include asks around smart giving, stock, crypto, etc. As an example, please consider donating today using credit card, gifts of stock, cryptocurrency, or your donor advised funds. And we want to link, excuse me, to give stock or give crypto or gift from my donor advised funds on your main donate page, not just on your ways to give page, right? This is really important. And there's a secret. Here's an example from United Way, right, where you can give stock, IRA. They should have a DAF button here. And you can see how it's just normal. This is the normal link, the normal donate page that an email might go to. Super duper important, right? And why is this? Here's the secret of non-cash giving, which is so important. Research shows that reminding people about their investments and their assets lead them to spending or giving more. So including smart giving options alongside cash, like stock, like donor advised funds, it has two enormous impacts that are both very good for your work. The first is it gets more stock gifts. Asking for stock gifts gets more stock gifts. It's not revolutionary, but it is really important, and not enough people do it. And we know that an average stock gift is well over $10,000, oftentimes from the same people who would give you $100. And so this is a big, big deal, right? More non-cash gifts drive a lot better outcomes. The other thing that is less intuitive is when we use these types of gifts to remind people about assets, about their investment funds, about their retirement funds, it actually leads one to believe that this will increase the size of your cash gifts. Why? Because reminding people of their wealth and reminding people of assets increases the size of cash gifts because they're just thinking more broadly and their anchor points change. And so suddenly you're getting a lot larger cash gifts. And these bigger gifts are the fastest way to hit your goals, as opposed to getting more gifts from more donors. So this is a huge portion that I hope you do well over the next few years. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about some resources available, and then we're going to dive into questions, and then we will end a little bit early. So I hope that sounds good to folks. First things first. So my colleague Phoebe, thank you, Phoebe, pardon me, is going to drop a survey in the chat right now. That is it's the lowest link you should see in the chat. And we would love for you to take 3 minutes right now to fill out this survey. Probably 90 seconds is more like it. What is in the survey? First reason to take the survey is this is how you get a copy of the slides and the recording. So we want to send you that. It is also how we're going to send you, or at least 20 of you, a copy of Americana by Bu Srinivasan. Amazing book, really, really interesting. You know, trigger warning, history of American capitalism has a lot of violence in it and a lot of other things. So I'm just going to name that, but super interesting about how the world came to be the way it is. So please make a note in the survey if you'd like to do that. Second is soon, and we are putting the finishing touches and the bow on the DAF report right now, but FreeWill is putting out the first DAF report of 2024. It is an incredibly in-depth insight into how different types of organizations, sizes of organizations like yours are facing different DAF challenges and what they're seeing in the market, as well as a bunch of really interesting data. That's a first look at growth in 2023. So in the survey, also please make a note if you want this, and you will receive a link to download the report once it's released. So we're still going to do some final edgings on the research, but we want to get some of the top lines to you today so we can start shaping your strategy. And then for folks that are interested, on Thursday, my colleague Michael is going to be walking through what we call our Smart Giving Suite. So a Smart Giving Suite is an easy way to help donors give some of these non-cash gifts and a really easy way for you to get started, right? So it's a very quick, massive upgrade to the organization. If you're saying, oh, how do I get beyond just asking for cash gifts? This is a really good way to dramatically transform in about a month. And so it tends to be affordable. It's exciting, really some best-in-class technology. We're not going to talk about it now. But if you're interested in what tools other organizations are using to get more donor advised fund gifts and more stock gifts and more smart gifts across the board, make a note in the survey and then come to that. It'll be about half an hour on Thursday, so 47 hours from right now. Courtney asks, where is the survey link? Courtney, the survey link should be in the chat. Thank you for that. Okay, so next step 1, fill out the survey, please. Step 2 is that in 2 weeks, remember I told you there are 3 massive trends facing philanthropy right now: DAFs, the Great Wealth Transfer, and artificial intelligence. In 2 weeks, we're going to dive a lot into some of the huge trends affecting planned giving in 2024. So if you want to come to that, you will also get an invite. We'd love to have you there. Super interesting. And we are going to do a ton of homework between now and then to make sure it's as useful as possible to you. Lastly, if you have anything to share or questions, you can always email me at patrick@freewill.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm Patrick Schmitt. I'm at FreeWill. It's very easy to find, and would love to connect and hang out with you there. Okay, we're going to do 5 minutes of questions, and then we're going to wrap up a little bit early. So we're going to pause on screen sharing. And let's dive into some questions. All right. First question. Arlene says, your slide says monies are transferred to a sponsoring institution. Wouldn't the majority of these be financial institutions to manage the funds? Arlene, the sponsoring institution is itself technically a charity, whereas the stuff managing the mutual funds is not. So in the same way that a college, which is a charity, might have an endowment, and that endowment might be managed by a bank, the bank is managing the money, but the ownership over it is the sponsor organization. So I hope that's helpful. Valerie says, if the donor gets an immediate tax break when depositing into the fund, why do most of them then make their grants at year end? Why do we make grants at year end if the tax benefit has already happened? Great question. If anyone else has thoughts, feel free to put that in the chat. But my thought is that this goes back to the idea that you don't get what you don't ask for. And people are asking for donations the most at the year end. And existing habits and patterns stay true. So if you are a 65-year-old who's donor advised fund, and every year you've sat at the table with your spouse at the end of the year to figure out where to make gifts, you're not going to change that pattern, even if the money is now coming out of grants, out of donor advised funds. So what's happening is you're meeting with your financial advisor at the end of the year about a lot of things, and what should we shift into a donor advised fund? And at the same time, you're meeting with your family and saying, where should we be giving this year? And maybe we'll give it out of our donor advised fund, especially to the organizations that have asked for it. So that's really important. Camilla says, who gets the interest from a fund? If things are invested in bonds and generating interest, or getting dividends from stocks, or the stocks are just growing, where does that go? Well, that stays in the account. So part of the reason that DAFs have grown so much is that if you put $1 million in a DAF fund and you haven't given it out, and the stock market goes up by 20%, you might have 1.2 million to grant now. And so, there's just more money to give. So great question there. Becky says, what would the messaging for a strategic solicitation geared for DAF donors look like to talk about making my charity their beneficiary? Becky, this is a great question. So one thing you might do is just offer information. And I gave some messaging in the webinar later, probably after you asked this question, but basically said, hey, a lot of people don't know this about donor advised funds. Maybe you do, but would you like some options? And we can talk about what those options are. And that sort of guidance can go a really long way. Andy says, if they've set a minimum, then do they waive the fees for a certain period, or until there's a minimum in the account? Andy, unlike a Wells Fargo bank account, you can't ever go below zero in your donor advised fund. And typically the fees tend to be a portion of AUM, right? Assets under management, or a portion of managed funds. So it might be 1% a year, it might be 0.5% a year, but it tends to be that no matter what the size is. In some cases, that goes down as the numbers get really big. Lisa says, are you allowed to give small tokens of appreciation to donors connected with DAF, which would meet, or does that violate tax laws? So the answer is, it depends, right? So things that are recognition, that don't have tangible value, are fine. A pin, putting someone in a society, even things like naming buildings tend not to have cash value, even though it is worth something to have, a building at Harvard named after you. What you can't do is do things like give basketball tickets, right? At some point, when my alma mater, Georgetown, used to have a better basketball team, and they probably still do this, they would give away basketball tickets at a certain donation level. And you cannot do that with a donor advised fund, right? Because you're giving some value for that. So great question. All right, let's do one more question and then we will wrap it up. There's an anonymous question that says, is it true that January is the best time to ask for donor advised fund gifts? It really can be. So I think, year end is still the best time. January, February tend to be a very large granting period, even though they're not a high gifting period for the other types of giving. Now, why is that? Well, it's because a lot of people put money into their DAF at the end of the year and said, okay, we'll sort it out at the beginning. And then if you ask for gifts early in the year, in January, February, March, you'll actually get them, right? But the best time is really start every time you're asking for any sort of contribution, reminder to ask for a donor advised fund grant at the same time, right? In the same way that you don't send, you don't send separate things, be like, oh, did you know you can give by PayPal now? Or, you can give by American Express. All of these things are just ways to pay. And we should start thinking about that as being built into the normal everyday flow of our work. All right. We're going to pause here. We're going to end a little bit early just to give everyone some time back. But I want to say a huge, huge, huge thank you. If you haven't already, please fill out the survey in there. We've been really excited to have you here. We know this is so important. We're going to keep sort of diving in on donor advised funds over the course of the year as new information and new strategies reveal themselves. But this is an incredibly important component, along with the other types of smart gifts, that are really going to enable you to hit your goals. It's not even close how much bigger organizations are getting when they're focusing on non-cash gifts compared to just pure cash. Marcia says, you missed my question. Can I email you? Yes, of course. So you can email me at patrick@freewill.com. But it's so good to have you all here, and really proud of everybody for pushing themselves and learning. We are in a brave, new, constantly changing world, and it's fun to navigate it together. So have a wonderful week. Happy spring, and we'll look forward to talking to you relatively soon.